So answer to the previous question, I don't think it's a variant issue. It's just the translators have put that phrase in different places. They have chosen to put it in different places. The commentaries show no sign of variance on that one. Okay. Let's get back together. We're starting on verse 8 to 17. Let's take a look. So he's writing to the Roman, and he says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God, whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of His Son, is my witness, how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray that now at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. I long to see you, so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I may have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles. I am obligated to both the Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." Once again, this is NIV 2011. Now, two paragraphs. One's kind of about Paul and his relationship to the church in Rome. And then we have a second paragraph that is probably one of the most contentious, theologically significant passage in the church history, right there. Okay, but I want you to note that there's a relationship between the two paragraphs. The second paragraph is the relationship is the cause of the first. It's for. There's a gar there, that there's this, and it's because of this. Okay? So this theological section is really in service of this passage up here. Okay? So I want to put that in context for you. A lot of people, we started taking this out and started looking at it. And I'm going to do that, but I want you to remember that this is in service of this. Okay, so if you want to do it that way, then we need to begin by reading this and then go back and see what happens, how it relates to that. So we're going to start with the second paragraph. Okay, and this is the second paragraph, and you notice another for in there. So there's a for in verse 17. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, and then for in the gospel the rest of God is revealed. So once again, 17 is really the starting point. 17 is the starting point, and then you get to 16, and then you work your way backwards to the whole section before. That's kind of the logical structure in this passage. Okay, so we need to look at verse 17. Going backwards, typical Paul. Okay. And in this verse, there are phrases in here that are so theologically loaded that we need to do a little bit talking about history of interpretation, which is very brief. The gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, and the phrase, the righteous will live by faith, which is Paul's quotation of Habakkuk. And it is critical to understand, first of all, the translation of this phrase changed world history. Because it is the understanding of this verse that triggered the Protestant Reformation. Okay, and to do that, we go to Martin Luther, who is obviously more than about 1,500 years after Paul, so very much later. And this is Paul's. So this is Luther writing about the verse we're looking at. Okay, this around. So he says it's 1519. Very good. Meanwhile. This is Luther's own writing. Meanwhile, in the same year, 1519, I, Luther, had begun... Let me back up. Martin Luther is a Christian monk who has a PhD in the Bible. He's a very smart monk. He's also, a tortured soul. He is so freaked out about his own sin and that God's going to judge him. He is petrified of it. Okay, he is constantly sensing his own flaws, own sinfulness, and he is kind of, in a way, haunted by all this. So when you start reading this section, you kind of get, if you start with that mindset, you understand where he's coming from, okay? I had begun to interpreting the Psalms once again. I felt confident that I was now more experienced as I had dealt in university courses with St. Paul's letter to the Romans, to the Galatians, and the letter of Hebrews. Yeah, we're reading the same thing. Isn't that exciting? Okay, so here's Luther reading the same thing. I had conceived a burning desire to understand what Paul meant in his letter to the Romans, but had thus far there has stood in my way not the cold blood around my heart, but the one word which is in chapter 1, the justice of God is revealed in it. Justia Deo, he's writing in Latin here, okay? But that is the phrase we were just looking at. He's looking at that phrase right there, the righteousness of God. He's reading in Latin, okay? So we can translate it as justice. But for in the gospel, the justice of God is revealed. So in the gospel of Jesus Christ, God's righteousness / justice is revealed. And he looks at that and he freaks out. I hated that word, justice of God. Okay? Which by the use and custom of all my teachers, I have been taught to understand philosophically as referring to the formal or active justice, as they call it, that is, that justice by which God is just and by which he punishes sinners and the unjust. Let's come back to what was taught at Luther's time. At Luther's period, righteousness of God, translated Justia Deo, refers to God's active justice in the world in blessing the righteous and punishing sinners. That's God's justice. And that is what the gospel reveals. So when you hear gospel, you think God's punishing sinners. Okay? That's what Luther was getting out of Romans 1. And he hated it. God, he's like, oh great, this is the gospel. How is that gospel? I have no idea, right? So that's what he's upset about. Is that any questions so far on what he was dealing with? Now, but I, blameless monk that I was, felt that before God I was a sinner with an extremely troubled conscience, and he was extremely troubled. I couldn't be sure that God was appeased by my satisfaction. Oh, I did not love, no, rather I hated the just God who punishes sinners. In silence, if I did not blaspheme, then I grumbled vehemently and got angry at God. I said, isn't it enough that we miserable sinners, lost for all eternity because of original sin, are oppressed by every kind of calamity through the Ten Commandments? Why does God heap sorrow upon sorrow through the gospel? And through the gospel threaten us with his justice and his wrath? Old Testament's bad enough. Get to the gospel, the New Testament, and in the gospel the justice of God's revealed. Enough! Right? That's what Luther's getting at. That was how I was raging with wild and disturbed conscience. I constantly badgered St. Paul about that spot in Romans 1 and anxiously wanted to know what he meant. Okay, so they tell you that verse is critical. And this guy was struggling with it, as you can tell. Number of years. I meditated day and night on those words until at last, by the mercy of God, I paid attention to their context. The next line. The justice of God is revealed in it, as it is written, the just person lives by faith. And I begin to understand that in this verse, the justice of God is that by which the just person lives by a gift of God. That is, by faith. I begin to understand that this verse means that the justice of God is revealed through the gospel, but it is a passive justice. That is, by which the merciful God justifies us by faith, as it is written, the just person lives by faith. All at once I felt that I had been born again and entered into paradise itself through open gates. Okay? There was a transformation for Luther of what is the justice of God. Instead of God's active punishment of sinners, it's actually God's justification of sinners. He gives sinners righteousness, a status of righteousness, regardless of whether they're sinners guilty or not. Actually, precisely because they're guilty, they're declared righteous. Okay, it's a righteous status, and this is what Luther did, and this triggered this dramatic transformation of how justification by faith and everything else that goes along with it. Now, I'm going to disagree with Luther. Okay, so I just want to set you up. I'm not trying to say, so, take that note down as being, okay, we're going to disagree with them. I'm not saying the previous people are right either. Okay, but let me go here a little bit, just summarize briefly about Luther. The righteousness of God does not refer to God's justice in punishing sinners, nor to anything else about God's character. It has nothing to do with God, really. Rather, it is a status or a quality that God gives to humans. It is a result of an act, justification, by which God declares a person who has faith to have the status of righteousness, not guilty of all charges. Okay? The act of justification is accomplished by Jesus suffering for the punishment for our sins and the imputation of his righteousness onto our account. If for those of you in the churches for been a while, you would have heard this. Okay? In fact, this would have been understood as the gospel. Instead of what we just talked about, this would have been considered the gospel. Okay? Imputation of righteousness, that whole shebang. Okay. Now Luther's insight and the subsequent history of the church means that the translation of the Bible is heavily influenced by this understanding of righteousness of God. So if you look at this phrase, for example, now RSV is being very literal, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. Look at NIV in 1984. For in the gospel a righteousness from God. Okay? That from is definitively not in there. It's righteousness of God. However you want to figure out the relationship between the two. But they specified it for you. It's not God's righteousness. It's that God gives you a righteousness. Right? This is Luther interpretation smack into NIV to 1984. Okay? Is revealed a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Now, Amplified Bible gets really amplified and gets really specific. For in the gospel, a righteousness which God ascribes to us, presumably, is revealed, both springing from faith and leading to faith. Okay. Now you notice, what's interesting is that NIV 2011 changed their mind. Okay? You see the movement? But that's because by the time 2011 come along, there's been enough of kind of the new perspective on Romans and the new movement that people are saying, let's go back to kind of the more literal rendition and let people make their own decisions. If this one says Luther was just right on, we don't have to deal with it anymore. Just tell it the way Luther says it. This one says, nah, maybe we're not so sure. So the NIV went back to the more literal translation because, frankly, yeah. Anyway, so my question, my point would be, once again, getting back to our methodology. Number one question: how would this phrase been heard by the Romans? Okay, that's the controlling question for interpreting this phrase. Not what Luther says, or not what his teachers said. How would this phrase have been heard by the Romans? Okay. And once again, remember, Paul's never been to Rome. So it's not like he could refer to, oh, remember that talk I gave about the righteousness of God? No, there's none of that going on. So he used the phrase. This phrase is publicly accessible. Okay, all the Romans knew what he's talking about, most likely right out of the Old Testament. In fact, that would probably be the only place they would get it from. Okay, so let's go to the Old Testament and figure out this phrase, righteousness of God. What does that phrase in the Old Testament mean? What does it refer to? Now, first of all, in the Old Testament, a group of Hebrew words share the same semantic range. Tzaddik, tzedek, and tzedakah. They all deal with be righteous, appear righteous, make righteous, declare righteous. You know, all the stuff shows up here. They're similar. In Greek, these words are translated in the Old Testament. They're translated into Greek, and you have these set of words, dikaiosune, showing up. That translates the noun form. So you have dikaiosune. It translates tzedek and tzedakah. And the basic concept behind these two words is a situation that is as it should be. So any activity or intention or state that leads to this ultimate goal can be denoted by these two words. So what do you mean by that? So a kitchen that is cleaned up properly is a righteous kitchen. If we're using the word tzedek and tzedakah, it's how we understand it. Okay, so if the room is orderly, that's a righteous kitchen. If places people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, that is a righteous situation. We tend to think of righteousness as on the moral dimension, right? Doing good things, not doing bad things. But any situation that's as it should be is a situation of tzedek or tzedakah. Okay, that's Hebrew. Now, in the Old Testament, God's tzedek, now we're applying the word not to God specifically now, is aimed at order in his creation and leading his community to its goal. It's his salvific will in action. It's God's internal character to make things right, and his action in making things right. Okay? It's about God. So we're going to point out something here that God's righteousness or righteousness of God never means a righteousness that is given to humans from God. Okay? It never shows up that way. That phrase, righteousness of God, is never a situation where God declares humans righteous. So Luther's interpretation of that phrase is non-existent in the Old Testament. So that should be a thing to worry about. Where did he get it from? Or how would the Romans have understood it that way?
Gerald, sorry,
Yeah.
we talked about it a bit when we did Genesis as well,
Yeah.
but is order really the key thing? I mean, a clean kitchen might be a kitchen that's never used. That's not a righteous kitchen, is it? A really messy kitchen but serving
Yeah.
up Babette's feast
Sure.
is wonderful.
Okay.
Right?
So that's just my I just kind of that reflects my own biases or perhaps my upbringing, but or family situation. But I would say you're right. But anything as it should be. I gave cling as an example. But whatever it should be, whatever God has in mind for the world, God has a character that drives him to make it right, whatever that looks like, and the action involved in making it right is all part of the righteousness of God.
Can you say though, like, if it doesn't appear in the Old Testament,
Yeah.
like that the righteousness, like imputation of righteousness, is part of the new covenant and not the old?
Right. So the question would be, Paul's writing this letter to Rome, and they get the phrase righteousness of God. What would they have understood by it, given that they never had any communication? Okay. Where would they draw that from? There is nothing. First of all, there's no Romans to draw from yet. Okay, so imputed. Is there any? Basically, there's no New Testament. So where would they get the idea of imputed righteousness from? That would be the problem. Okay, where do they draw that idea from? First of all, nobody had any thought of that until Luther did. 1,500 years later, nobody thought that phrase meant that until 1,500 years later. That's significant. Okay, and we're not teaching this in the early church. The early Romans were not passing this on. Oh, this is about imputed righteousness. They never said that. It's much later. Okay, so that's important. So we're talking about controlling. What interpretation controls? If we're saying the first century Roman church is what controls this, then we have to look at the Old Testament. If we say we're following a particular tradition, we're Lutherans, then Luther's interpretation control. Then you go right ahead. But this class has a different presupposition. Okay.
Well,
Just
So, Luther was writing in Latin, right?
Yes.
You said?
yes.
And so this concept of being right in right relationship
Yeah.
made it into what we have as righteousness now. But how does righteousness relate to justice, which is what he's writing about?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So they're all related terms. I mean, justia is what we think of today as justice. When we say righteousness, really rightness is probably a better term. So what Luther has in mind is it's not guilty. What he means by that is a status of being in the right. So I think that's probably a better concept. It's the status of being in the right. You're declared not guilty, declared winner of the trial. You are in the right, and that's the status that God gives. According to Luther, He gives to sinners, and that's what gospel reveals. Which for him is like, whew, awesome. All right. Now, let me give you an example in the Old Testament about the usage of the word tzedek and tzedakah. Okay. And this is Isaiah 51, talking about, listen to my people, give ear to me, my nation. Law is going forth from me, and my justice for a light to the peoples. My tzedek draws near speedily. Okay, or tzedki is Hebrew. My tzedek draws near speedily. My salvation has gone forth. You notice what NIV does with it? They translate it my deliverance. The parallels, my salvation. Salvation and tzedek are parallel things here. These things are coming. My arms will rule the peoples. God's reign is understood as His tzedek, His righteousness. Okay. Go down here. Lift up your eyes to the heavens, look at the earth beneath. But my salvation will be forever, and my tzedakah will never be ended. My righteousness will never be ended. Or, as NIV does it, my deliverance will never be ended. Okay. So they're basically here they can't translate righteousness because it makes no sense. So they decided we'll put in deliverance, but that's what he means anyway. What in Hebrew it's exactly correct. Tzedek and tzedakah refers to God's action in making things right, which deliverance is definitely part of those actions. Okay. So the word tzedek is just has broader, much broader semantic range than we're used to with the word righteousness. Hearken to me, you who know tzedek. Okay. Those whose law is in my heart, moth will eat them like garment, worm will eat like no from, but my tzedakah will be forever, and my salvation to all generations. So even in the Old Testament, this phrase of God's tzedek and tzedakah is about God's action to fixing what's wrong with the world. Which is not active justice punishing sinners. It's to make things work, make things the way they're supposed to be. God's restorative act is his righteousness. Yes?
There's a lot of discussion from Israelite kings about their sitting in judgment on people and how that's a very good thing. Like that brings about justice. Is tzedakah, are those used in those contexts as well?
They are actually used in terms of righteousness, to be a right in judgment, to be declared not guilty. But we're talking about specifically God's justice, God's righteousness. We're talking about a very narrow range of texts that deals with God's tzedek and tzedakah. Okay, and here, so what we're proposing really is that this phrase is not about God's punishing sinners, and it's not about a status given to humans. It's about God's action in fixing the world, God's commitment to fixing the world, and that makes the phrase in the gospel. God's commitment to fix the world is revealed. Makes perfect sense. The gospel is being understood as the coming of King Jesus to establish his reign on earth. Right? So just put in the gospel. For in this proclamation of the coming of King Jesus, who promised from the scripture beforehand, son of David, and he's going to establish his reign, calling obedience from all people, including you Romans. In that proclamation, God's commitment to make things work, to restore the way the world is supposed to be, is revealed. Okay? That would be the amplified version of that verse. Okay? Question before I move on to the Habakkuk verse. So I know this is different from imputed righteousness. Okay.
Actually, I was going to get a comment, not to go off on it too much, but it also seems important that Luther was reacting to the Catholic Church,
Yes.
which was talking about indulgences and was talking about
Yes.
other things. So it seems like, in the context of the Catholic Church and
Yeah.
his time, it makes sense. That isn't what's going on in the first century.
So that's a good point. That remember that what triggered the 95 theses on the wall was the selling of indulgences. Was it Leo X, I think? Shoot, I forget his name. The Pope was like, go to Germany, sell these indulgences, which takes away your time in purgatory. So you pay money and you get a paper that says 100 less years in purgatory. Okay, so. How do they do that? Well, their idea. Well, how can they do that? Well, the idea is that the medieval church had the idea that the church controls a bank of grace. So, martyrs, the saints, if they live really good lives, they bank a positive grace. Okay. So it's kind of a subtraction game, right? Grace subtracted by sin, and usually most of us in the negative, and if you're in the negative, you end up in purgatory. If you're in the positive, that grace gets banked into the church. Also in the relics, for example, a bone of a saint. If you go visit that bone, you can get some of the thing that's banked in that bone to you. So they visited relics, they visited bones. These are ways to get the grace from people. So the idea is the church controlled it. Since we control this bank of grace, we have the ability to transfer it to you. Kind of like if you have mileage, you can transfer to people from account to account. Like if you get credit card for air miles. So they say, okay, now we control this much. We can hand it out to people based on the money you give us. The church had that ability. Okay. So I think what your point is, if that's the mindset, then what Luther is really saying is, well, if that's the case, why can't God just do that directly from Jesus? If righteousness can be transferred, then he just Jesus had the ultimate amount of grace, just directly transfer there, and it's not controlled by the church, not meted out piecemeal, like here's a paper for 100 years, here's a paper for 100 years. No. It's absolutely complete. From Jesus once and for all, transferred, imputed righteousness. Right? So I can see that. I mean, that mindset fits in very well with the milieu of the medieval church. They already had the idea of credit transferring. So they just, Luther adopted it further, pushed it further. But the real question in the first century, was there any such idea of credit transferring? That's an interesting question.
Charles, we sort of set this up as a language of kings,
Yes.
which is royalty language. And how did that fit? How does righteousness fit into that?
Right.
Suddenly you have God as judge now rather than king here.
So I'm going to say, so I want to take you out of the judge language completely. I'm saying righteousness is God's commitment to make things right.
Right.
No justice being invoked here.
Right. So the first
Yeah.
century folks who read it would have got it. And then it got lost.
Yes. I would say we got lost because the Old Testament fell out of the. Once you get to the second, third century, you start realizing that these church fathers didn't really read the Old Testament very well. They didn't understand it. They were interfered with by Greek philosophy, and they saw the Old Testament as being and they didn't get what's happening in the Old Testament. And that's a very short answer to a long question, a big question of how they read the Old Testament. But when I go through them, I'm going, okay, every now and then you hit a gem, and most of it's pretty poor, because they just couldn't understand the idea that there's an actual king, an actual nation that's being promised, and so there's a lot of stuff happening that's kind of weird. But this is not about justice, and the king is right here. So if you want to say God is now committed to make things right, and the method by which he's doing it is by a king, that makes perfect sense. The world is a mess. We need a new kingdom, a new kingship. And Jesus, the Son of God, is now doing it. Jesus Christ is one who's calling the world into obedience through his death and resurrection on the cross. And the rest of the storyline is going to show, the rest of the book of Romans is going to show how that actually works. How does this proclamation of this new king reveal God's commitment to make things right? It does fit in that sense. Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
How does the faith language fit in there? And we're talking about righteousness.
We're coming up.
Oh, okay.
We're coming up. So we're still dealing with righteousness and gospel right now. We haven't got to the faith yet.
Quickly, does it seem like righteousness could also be said God's commitment to deliverance?
Sure.
Okay.
God's commitment to make things work, make things right, which includes deliverance out of slavery. But we haven't got that yet until chapter 5. Okay. So let's move forward a bit and get to Habakkuk, because you'll notice Luther's going to read this verse in a particular way, and that's going to influence how he understands the righteousness of God. And we're going to go to Habakkuk and see what it actually says. Okay. So here's Roman, and the verse that he quotes, Hodidikaios ek pisteos des zesetai. That's Romans 1:17b. The righteousness from faith will live. Ek is like out of. So the righteous out of faith will live. The Septuagint, the Greek translation is Hodidikaios ek pisteos mu. Mu is my. So the righteous from my faith will live. The MT, the Hebrew Bible, has the righteous by his faith will live. So first of all, there's a slight problem. The Hebrew is his, the Septuagint went with my, and Paul didn't have either. Just kind of lay that out there. That's the reality. I want you to see a little bit about the translations between RSV, NRSV, and the ESV footnote. Okay, there's an ESV on top line, and then there's a footnote. So the debate in the translation is, where do you put by faith? Do you put it with the righteous, or do you put it with the verb? That's really the crux of the question. Okay? So let's see how that changes. So RSV had it with righteous. He who through faith is righteous shall live. That's the Luther approach. Your righteous comes out of your faith. You have faith in God. God imputes his righteousness upon you because of your faith, and then you will live. So that's the Luther interpretation. Okay. Notice NRSV backed out of that one. NRSV says, nah, the one who is righteous will live by faith. So the faith dropped out of the front and went to the back. Now you notice in Greek, ek pisteos can literally go with either side. It could be with the subject or it could be with the verb. So both translations are perfectly fine. The RSV group, the RSV went with the Luther approach, and RSV says, "No, I'm not sure about that. Went the other way." An ESV footnote literally gives you both. On the top line, it has the one who's righteous shall live by faith. On the bottom, it says the one who by faith is righteous shall live. They actually give you both options right there in ESV. Okay, so you have top line and footnote. Usually, the footnote is the minority position. They have a commission. They usually have a committee, and there's a vote. And the majority vote gets on the top line, and the minority vote gets on the bottom line. That's kind of how it goes in how these Bibles get made. Yeah, it's just a vote. Okay, so who's right? Who's right? Well, what you do is you want to go back to Habakkuk because I'm convinced, and I think growing numbers of scholars are convinced, that when Paul quotes out of the Old Testament, he's not quoting willy-nilly. It's not just some kind of a word association popped in there. He's actually quoting the entire section. He's dealing with the verse as it is in its context. So that's really important. So let's give Paul that prop and at least say, hey, he's not like just pulling things out of context. He's actually cares about what Habakkuk says. So this verse shows up in chapter 2, verse 4 of Habakkuk. And let me give you a very brief rundown of what's happening in chapter 1 of Habakkuk. Okay, and you can go home and read it, and this is kind of a brief rundown. And Habakkuk is, he's prophet, and he's like talking. And he's saying, "Oh Yahweh, why the injustice?" So if you look at 1 through 4, he's talking about the injustice that's happening in Israel. And he's like, what is going on here? Why all these things happening? And he's really upset about it. And then he hears from God in verses 5 through 11. Yahweh says to him, the punishment is coming via the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, if you will. It's coming. Punishment is coming. And Habakkuk says, wait a minute. This is prophet's response. The Chaldeans are worse than us. That doesn't make sense. Like, you want to punish us with somebody who's worse than us. They're more immoral than we are, and they're going to crush us and destroy us, and we're going to be punished by them? So that's the Habakkuk's question, and it is in this context that chapter 2, verse 4 show up. Okay. So this is what Habakkuk says. He says, I will take my stand to watch and station myself on the tower and look forth to see what he will say to me. How's God going to answer that question, right? And what I will answer concerning my complaint. And then Yahweh answered me, write the vision, make it plain upon tablets, so he may run who reads it. Okay. Think iPad, I guess. I don't know. It's going to be big words. For still the vision awaits its time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. It seems slow. Wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, he whose soul is not upright in him shall fail, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Okay? So let's just kind of take a look at what's going on in this passage. God's saying, look, there's going to be a vision coming, and it seems like it's slow. You got the Chaldeans coming, attacking you, and you think, that doesn't make any sense. Well, God's going to fix this problem. God's going to establish his rightness in this situation. It's going to take, it may seem slow, but you got to wait for it. You got to be patient. And some people whose soul is not upright, they're going to fall apart in the situation. But the righteous people, they're going to live. They're going to live by their faith in what?
That his plan is making things right.
But God's going to do it. So you're going to live by waiting for God to act in the situation. Okay. So what's interesting about this is that you have the righteous person in his faith. He's going to believe in God's faithfulness. Okay. So a righteous person will live by his faith, and that he will live by believing God's faithfulness. And that really is interesting, because you notice what the Septuagint did. What he did was, he says, well, that's not quite clear. So the Septuagint writer dropped his and made him mine, because it's the same idea. Right? The righteous will live by his faith in my faithfulness. So his faith, and the Habakkuk, the Septuagint says, that's not that clear. How about my faith? Or he will live by my faithfulness. It's communicating the same idea. But you notice that because both ideas are in play. He can't just live by his faith. His faith in what? Faith that God's going to act. That's what the context demands. The righteous will live by his faith in God's faithfulness. So one has his faith, one has my faith, and Paul drops both.
This is a little tangential, but
Yeah.
we just went through the Job series. Is that what God meant by how Job is righteous? The idea that Job believed God would make everything right, and that's why he never cursed God. Or no?
That is a long question, and not an easily answered one.
All right,
So
well,
let's save that for another day. Maybe we'll do Job one of these days. But that's an interesting one. It's a good interesting point. But let me hold here. Okay, so let me make sure I'm clear, right? The Habakkuk in Hebrew was emphasizing the man's faith in God's faithfulness. The Septuagint writer says, no, really should emphasize God's faithfulness in the situation. I think to a certain extent, Paul is saying it's both. It's faithfulness. And if you notice the language that we're going to get to, in the gospel, a righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is. Okay, this is a little tricky. By faith from first to last translates the Greek phrase ek pisteos eis piston, which literally means out of faith into faith. Rats. so okay, first of all, the gospel's not there. It's actually in it, but okay, NIV is helping you out there. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed. The second righteousness is not there in the Greek, okay? So in it, the righteousness of God is revealed, ek pisteos eis piston. Out of faith into faith. Is it any wonder that this is a hard passage to read? Okay, so, and then the righteous will live by faith. So let me see if I can pull this together. I think it's easier to pull this together. Paul understands the Habakkuk passage as being a situation in which a person has faith in God's faithfulness. Right? So the righteous will live by that faith. Okay? Which is their faith and God's faithfulness, both together. Which, as you can see, it's already implied in that passage, ek pisteos eis piston. It comes out of faith and it brings about faith. So the question here is, whose faith, which one's which? Okay? You have a person's faith, everyone who believes. By the way, I'm going to say put that believe in here as well, because pisteuo, believe, is the same root as piston, faith. They're all related. In English, it falls apart. Belief and faith are not the same. In Greek, pisteuo, piston, they're the same root. Okay, so we have people who believe in God, and because God has faithfulness, and I'm going to argue that because you look at the trajectory of Romans eventually, is that we believe in God's faithfulness. From God's faithfulness will bring about our faithfulness. We believe in God's faithfulness in bringing about our faithfulness. It's a almost circular process. We have faith that God is faithful to bring about our faithfulness. That's what kind of this passage is getting at. Okay, which implicit in here is already transformation, that we're called to be transformed. But we're going to get to that in Romans. That's a huge topic. I mean, huge theme in Romans. We can't really miss it. But this verse here is kind of this very kind of subtle, kind of thematic declaration of what's going to happen. But it's not explicit yet. Questions?
Is the our faith part more our belief or our faithfulness?
Which part? Which one?
The out of faith into faith part.
Yeah. So I'm arguing that it's out of God's faithfulness for the purpose of our faithfulness.
For the purpose of our faithfulness,
Right.
not
So
for the
based-
purpose of our belief.
Right.
Okay.
Because that'd be silly. Because we already have everyone who believes, right? So we believe in God's faithfulness, and God's faithfulness is going to bring about our faithfulness. So I don't want to. I don't because the book of Romans doesn't stop at belief; it moves toward transformation, heavily into transformation, or what we call sanctification. Right. So if you want to think of it this way, is belief, God's faithfulness, our sanctification. You want to put it in those terms, that'd be fine. But this is merely hinted at and kind of categorized early on. Okay. So let's again put these two verses 17 together and then go back to 16 and then go back to the previous passage and then we're done. Okay. So God is committed to fixing the world. And that commitment is revealed in the gospel, coming of the King. And the gospel is entered into by people who believe in it, who put their faith in it. And in so doing, they place their faith in God's faithfulness so that it will lead to the transformation of those who are inside. So they become faithful as well. Okay. And this is the power of God. Okay. That He can do this. And that is salvation. Okay. And that's the power of God. And for that reason, this God's going to be committed to do all of this. He is not ashamed of the gospel. Okay. Now, why does He say He's not ashamed of the gospel? I mean, let me, okay, before because that's transitioning, sorry, before I ask that question. Any question on that summary just now? Before I move on to its connection to the previous verse.
Charles,
Yes.
would you like to paraphrase? It's my faithfulness to trust in God's faithfulness, and it's God's faithfulness to engender that trust in me.
I would say slightly differently. I would say I believe that I have faith in God's faithfulness in making me faithful. And faith is not merely belief; it's I become a faithful person,
Right.
right? Which is actually salvation. Because salvation is not merely because here it's not about saving anybody from hell. It's about moving out of Romans and get to. It's moving out of the control of sin and death, so that we become transformed people, sanctified people. So I know I'm previewing, but Paul's perspective is we need to be saved from sin. That's we're under the reign of sin, and we need to be saved from it. So salvation is about stopping that slavery and being freed from it, and to live a faithful life. So we believe in God's faithfulness to bring us out and put us into a place of faithfulness.
So this whole Jesus business
Yeah,
reveals to us
that God's doing that.
that God is going to be transforming us, that God is faithful to transform us, so
Yes.
we can believe in that.
Yes.
And we will live by which of those faiths?
So we will live by the initial faith.
The belief.
That belief
one.
that counts on the other two.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay.
You got it.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
We believe that the righteous God, God who makes things right, is going to make us.
Right.
Right.
Bingo. That's much better than the way I said it. That's much better. Exactly. That's exactly what this is about. Hence, he says, that's the gospel, and that's why I am not ashamed of it. I am not totally not ashamed of the gospel. Yes.
So the NIV translators decided to translate it as by faith from first to last.
Yeah.
And
RSV went
I
with.
don't know what that means. Even in
Nobody knows what it means.
Why would they end up with that? Because it doesn't seem to mean anything to anybody. So it must have meant something to the translator, right? Or the translators.
Well, no, you're asking me to read minds. It's a committee, mind you.
Right. So
If it's a committee work, you always have to worry about they're probably working with like the least objectionable translation. So you end up voting for a translation that nobody likes, but nobody really hates.
and nobody understands it, so they can't object.
Okay, now you're asking me to speculate on what's happening.
Okay.
I'm just saying that I don't know what that means.
Okay.
Okay, but I'm looking at the Greek and I'm going, the Greek actually makes more sense than the English.
Right.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, it's not Greek to me, it's English to me now. Okay. All right. So
the
yeah.
from faith to faith
Yeah.
part gets a little bit closer, because that's like from God's faithfulness to
Which translation is that? RSV?
NRSV.
NRSV. Yeah, exactly. They're more
Sorry,
literal.
No, NKJV.
NKJV. Yeah, the KJV is actually very literal. So they will do this. They will say from faith to faith. Now that doesn't make much sense. They say it makes more sense than from faith first to last, which is like I don't know what that means, but okay. Yeah. Good. So let me do my transition again. So for this reason, this is the power of God to make people right. Okay, the righteous God to make people right, and that's the power of God. So that's why he's not ashamed. And now the question is, why does he say that he's not ashamed? Why would that show up in the first place?
Because he wants the Romans to believe that he's not just going to bail out once he makes it to Spain.
Okay, very good point, except I would say, look at this passage, and I want to show you something quite interesting about this passage. This passage is actually hilarious. In its insistency on a particular theme, which is, I really, really want to come and see you, and couldn't. God, who I serve in my spirit preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness. God is my witness is an oath. As God is my witness, I remember you. Oh, by the way, this semicolon isn't there. I mean, I don't know why they did that. If you look at RSV, they didn't have that. In my prayer all the time, and I pray, God is my witness that I pray, at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. I long to see you. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order to have a harvest among you. That's why I'm so eager to preach the gospel also to you in Rome. Don't you get it? I really want to come to Rome. Okay. So, the insistency is so heavy. I mean, this entire passage is, I want to come to Rome and couldn't. Seriously, I really wanted to come to Rome. That you know, that thou protestest too much. I think it's almost inevitable to suggest that somebody thinks that Paul should have been in Rome earlier, and for some reason he doesn't go. Now, Paul is probably well known by this time as somebody who's spinning around in Greece and in Asia Minor in Turkey, but never made it to Rome. Why not? Okay. Now, I think it's fairly easily you end up with this understanding that Paul's going around preaching in Asia Minor, in Greece, about like Jesus and all that kind of stuff, and Jesus is Lord, that's great. But he doesn't dare to come to Rome. Rome is the capital. Rome is where Caesar is. Rome is where, if Nero goes nuts, you're the primary target. You got a target on your back. Okay? He doesn't have the guts to come to Rome. So what we have here is this, I really wanted to come all this time. Okay, let me explain myself, and I am not ashamed of the gospel. You might think I am. You might think that you wouldn't dare preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, our Lord, in the capital of Roman Empire. I am. Trust me, I am. I am coming. Okay? And I'm going to hang out with you for a while, and then I'm going to go to Spain. Okay? So you have this, so which is why I'm saying this entire section down here was really in service of explaining why he hasn't been there all this time. Okay, so you might suggest almost the entirety of the chapters 1 through 8 is kind of in service of the explanation. This is my gospel. I believe it firmly. I'm not ashamed of it. It's the power of God to transform the whole world. So of course I'm bringing it to Rome. So, anyway, so now you see, I am not ashamed of the gospel. You see the connection between the two paragraphs. And now, starting next time we meet in verse 18, we're going to get into his exposition of the gospel. Okay, how exactly does the gospel is act for salvation, and how does it bring about faithfulness, God's faithfulness, into our faithfulness? All those different bits and pieces are going to be exposited, starting from verse 18 all the way to chapter 8. So, I'm done. Questions? Or comments? Okay. So, shall I pray for us? Let me do that. Father, we want to understand the gospel. We want to understand your power. We want to understand what this all means. We want to understand the power that transforms, that makes us right, makes the world right. the vision that you proclaim through your Son, Jesus Christ. We want to know it, and we want to see it in action in our lives. We want to see transformation in how we see ourselves, how we think of the world, how we interact with people around us, in the institutions that we're part of. We want to see your power at work. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen.